about passing, I couldn't imagine what revealed.
Good morning, everybody. I wanted to, first of all, welcome you and congratulate you on coming here on this very blustery, cold day. It's quite a challenge. And I also want to say that this is the first of a series of America 250 programs that we'll be giving. And those programs include our book club, which all three topics will be associated with the Revolutionary War and the early Republic this year. The first of those topics on how the British lost America begins next Friday. So just keep your eyes open. I apologize to those of you who got here early because there was this discrepancy on the website as opposed to other sources about when we started, but we started at 10:30 and here we are. So welcome. And I'm extremely pleased to also welcome, I'm honored to have him here, Max Carter. He is the retired William R. Rogers Director of Friends Center and Quaker Studies at Guilford College. He was raised on a dairy farm in the Quaker belt of north central Indiana and active in the Western Quakers prior to his seminary work at Earlham School of Religion. During his PhD studies in American religious history at Temple University, he was active with Philadelphia Quakers and taught at Friends Select School and Friends Central School in Philadelphia. Since 1990, he has lived in Greensboro, North Carolina, where he and his wife Jane are members of New Garden Friends Meeting. A Vietnam-era conscientious objector, Max did alternative service teaching at the Ramallah Friends School in the occupied Palestinian West Bank and has maintained a close relationship with that area ever since. He and Jane co-lead annual service learning trips to Palestine and Israel to acquaint participants with the situation and accompany the Palestinians and Israelis working for a just peace. Will you please welcome Max Carter?
Now, you know, Quakers are quiet people. This is how we applaud. Actually, that's how we kind of do it. Will's actually a senior at Guilford, so he's been through the paces. And a history major. So, and we've got a bunch of historians here, so I'll should just hand this over to them. But delighted to have this opportunity to share a bit about the Quaker influence. We didn't quite invent America, but a good deal of Quaker influence on the founding documents and the founding character of the United States. And we'll eventually get to that, but you're probably familiar with the Quaker influence locally. Certainly here in High Point, you've got streets named after the Englishes and Nathan Hunt and the Blairs and Mendenhalls, and there are Hayworth or two, I think, mixed in there, including with the beginning of the industries that defined High Point, furniture, and the model farm program that helped save not only this community, but Southern Quaker community that was established there around the Springfield Friends Meeting. Certainly educational influence, the William Penn School that was here, that began down at Asheboro as a normal and industrial school for blacks after the Civil War, and produced John Coltrane. And just outside the city limits of High Point in Trinity, a little combined Methodist Quaker school that eventually became Duke. And a little Quaker college down the road in Greensboro. So a lot of influence of Quakers here locally, and certainly in the state. Formerly known village just on your southern border, Bush Hill, now Archdale, named after the Quaker governor of the Carolinas, when this was essentially a Quaker colony in the late 1600s. It took an act of Parliament and of the Church of England to get rid of Quakers in government in South Carolina back in the late 1600s, early 1700s. The assembly was largely Quaker. The governor, John Archdale, was Quaker. The first public school, Simon's Creek, was Quaker. The first organized Christian denomination was Quaker, North Carolina Yearly Meeting, 1698. And Parliament got a little concerned about the Quaker influence on their colony. And so the way they could get rid of them was when Queen Anne ascended the throne, they required all people in government to swear an oath of allegiance to the new queen. Quakers won't swear oaths. So that got rid of us in government. We hung around. And there's still so many Quakers in the colony that the Church of England established two missionary societies, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and the Society for the Preservation of Christian Knowledge, to send missionaries to the colonies to win back not only those heretic Quakers, but the Baptists and a few other nonconformists. And those first missionaries reported back to Canterbury and London that the colony was under a dark cloud of Quakerism. And certainly, some of the history of the influence of Quakers here in North Carolina's Quaker belt up through the Civil War, that when a convention was proposed to meet to decide on whether to vote for secession at the beginning of what became the Civil War, these counties voted essentially about 25-1 against even holding that convention because of that Quaker influence. But what we want to look at is, what was the influence on the nation, on the founding of the United States? And before getting into that, I want to give some ground out of which Quakerism emerged, because it really helps explain why Quakers had the kind of testimonies they had, what some of that influence that they had on the founding of the United States and the founding documents, where that came from. And so we go back to the English Civil War, which is remembered as vividly there as the Civil War here is remembered in the South. And that would be in the 1640s in England. It was the time when King Charles I had essentially circumvented Parliament. It pretty much just laid Parliament down for about 20 years. And when the church-state relationship was such that the Archbishop Laud supported what the king did and gave that imprimatur of the church on whatever King Charles wanted, and led to civil war between the parliamentary forces and the king. And that led to the execution of the Archbishop in 1645 and the execution of the king in 1649, beheading of Charles I. So you get a little sense of how they reacted to authority during that period. In that period of war, of vicious, bloody war between the parliamentary forces and the royal forces, spawned quite a bit of conversation in the army camps and broader society of what were the rights of the common people. How do we address the authority of the church and state? And those of you who've studied that era know that there are a lot of interesting groups that emerged out of that period. The diggers, who would go out, urban gardening guerrillas who'd go out at night and dig up the common land that had been set aside, for the common people to graze their sheep, to raise vegetables, been absconded with by other folk, and they'd go out and dig it up and plant vegetables. The levelers, who sought to level the social distinctions and inequalities of society. The ranters, who believed the only authority came from themselves. And the seekers, who sought to reform the church within or without. Those seekers, some stayed within the church and tried to reform it from within. Others left, formed conventicles, and tried to reform religion from outside of the authority of the church. The Muggletonians, the Fifth Monarchists, all these various groups arguing about the rights of the common people and what proper authority ought to guide our religious, our ecclesiastical, or political lives. And the Quakers. Quakers emerged out of that milieu. And we don't have a real birth date for Quakerism, but we kind of look to 1652 and George Fox's epiphany on the top of Pendle Hill, his arrest, his preaching. But he wasn't the only Quaker. Many early Quakers and leaders came out of the New Model Army, came out of the experience of that Civil War and questioned all of those sorts of issues that emerged in the Civil War period. But by 1652, you had a Quaker movement, which wasn't called that officially yet. The official name, the Religious Society of Friends, didn't come for several decades later. Quakers was a pejorative term, leveled at us because we quaked and shook, enthusiastic kind of religious fervor. Our original names were Children of Light, Publishers of Truth, or Primitive Christianity Revived. They simply wanted to revive original Christianity. And that certainly plays into these themes too, when you return to the simple teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus' life and witness. Now, out of that movement, I want to highlight one particular person to give you some sense of, again, some of the themes we'll be exploring here. George Fox, again, gets a lot of the attention. His wife, Margaret Fell, James Naylor, Elizabeth Hooton, many of the early Quakers. I want to focus on Mary Fisher initially. Mary Fisher was converted or convinced of the Quaker message in 1651 when she heard George Fox preach. And she then started to carry the Quaker message herself. She would not necessarily interrupt preachers in their Anglican services, but would dispute with them in worship, which was allowed at that time. And of course would be thrown in jail, where she would suffer a good deal, along with so many other Quakers who were thrown in jail. These were not Martha Stewart kind of prisons. These were foul, stinking jails, they called them. She was thrown in jail one time. The windows were boarded up and no food was allowed in. They tried to starve her to death. And people would sneak her food and she survived. But she continued to try to carry the message of Quakerism, which essentially for her was the authority by which you should be guided in your life is an inward light. That God speaks directly to the souls of each person that God has created. And not the authority of the church or the state, but that inward light. And that is within you which will save you, which will guide you if you turn to it and are guided by it. And that was not overly popular by those who were in authority in the church or the state. Her most famous journey was in 1658 when she and some compatriots decided to go and share the Quaker message to the Pope. Went to Rome, not overly well accepted. One of her compatriots, I think, died there in Rome. But she carried on by herself to go see the Sultan of Turkey, Sultan Mehmed IV. Got a passage on a ship that was to take her to Turkey, and when the captain of the ship learned that that was her intent to protect her, he turned the ship around, dropped her off someplace else, and she, not dissuaded, walked from Greece to northwest Turkey, where she found Sultan Mehmed IV encamped with his army on the battlefield and convinced someone to escort her to have meetings with him. He received her well. She simply shared the Quaker message, and all Mehmed responded to that was, well, what do you make of the Prophet Muhammad? And her response was, we can judge him by the fruit of his life. He said, works for me. And had her safely escorted. She refused armed escort, but left and eventually settled in Charleston, South Carolina. Married, one husband died, married again, and she's buried in Charleston, South Carolina. But I highlight her to give you some sense of how important that understanding Quakers had of an inward light, that is your authority, and how that guided them and what that message meant. Also, the power and ability of these women to carry that message and to be representatives of Friends at a time when ordained clergy were male. The first two Quakers to step foot in what is now the United States were two women, Mary Fisher and Ann Austin, in 1656. They landed in Boston, where they were immediately stripped naked and flogged and then shipped out. And so they came back. And you know a bit of that history when later on Mary Dyer, one of the Quakers, missionaries to Boston, was hanged in Boston, along with three other compatriots, William Lederer, William Robinson, Marmaduke Stevenson. But you see the strength of these women, their equality in carrying the message, and the ground out of which that message arose. And these all, I think, are important in understanding the later Quaker influence on the founding of America and its character. So let's take a look at that in particular. And I want to highlight three sources that I don't know if the library has these, probably not, but one good source for understanding the Quaker influence is Seth Henshaw's Quaker Influence on American Ideals. Seth Henshaw was a recorded Friends minister here, superintendent of North Carolina Yearly Meeting. Many of you probably knew Seth Henshaw. Grew up in the Holly Spring community in Randolph County. Friends Indeed is the story of Quaker social reform in America by Susan Sachs Goldman. She was the chair of the Board of Trustees of Sidwell Friends School. And in witnessing how Quakers made decisions on that board, she became fascinated by Quaker decision making. And if you know anything about Quaker decision making, in our business meetings, we do not vote. We use a process we call sense of the meeting, what many people refer to as consensus. Everyone has to agree or agree not to agree. There are various protocols, but it's based on an understanding that everyone has that inward light. Everyone has access to truth, a direct and immediate access to the divine and to truth. So you'd better darn well take seriously everyone's perspective, everyone's understanding of truth, so you can come to a larger understanding, a better understanding of the full truth rather than a simple majority-minority. And fascinated by that, she then started to take a look at other influences of Quakers, and it's an excellent book. And then I took part of the title of today's talk from David Yount's How the Quakers Invented America. A little overstatement, but David Yount is a member of the Alexandria Friends meeting, which is interestingly located on an Army base, although members of the Alexandria meeting in Virginia say, no, the Army base is located on our meeting property. But he's a syndicated columnist, an author, and seminary head at one point. The other two major references that I want to turn to get some understanding of the Quaker influence on America are, of course, William Penn's own writings. Two in particular, his Frame of Government in 1682, as Pennsylvania was being established, and the 1701 Charter of Privileges that William Penn wrote. I want to look at those two, and then we're going to get into the high weeds. So the Frame of Government in 1682 came about. William Penn was given this grant of land by Charles II to pay off a debt owed to his father, Admiral Penn. William Penn was another convinced friend, raised in the Church of England, but was convinced of the Quaker message when he was working on his father's estates in Ireland and heard the itinerant Quaker minister Thomas Lowe. Became a friend and spent some time in the Tower of London, where he wrote "No Cross, No Crown." And to pay off the debt that the king owed his father, a loan that was given to promote one of the military adventures of the king, gave William Penn this grant of land in the New World. And quite famously, Penn said, "You don't own it. I don't own it. You know who owns it? It's the native people there." And so sent his agents over in 1681 to negotiate how they would live together. And you get the famous non-existent Treaty of Shakamatsin that is artistically rendered in that Benjamin West painting of William Penn and Native Americans in treaty. And really it was a series of treaties by agents, later on William Penn. But I think as Voltaire said, it was the treaty with Native Americans with Europeans that was never signed, but never broken. Well, it was broken by William Penn's sons later on, but that's a whole other story. But in 1682, you've got Pennsylvania that William Penn purchased from the Lenape and those who had suzerainty over them, the Iroquois Confederacy. He bought it twice. And then agreed on the principles of how, if they needed more land eventually, how they would negotiate that. And that was the famous walking treaty, that they could buy additional land as much as a person could walk from sunrise to sunset along a certain border. And William Penn's sons weren't necessarily very good Quakers. In fact, only one remained officially a Quaker. The other two returned to the Church of England. Hired a professional runner to run a previously cleared path that added like 3 times as much land to that treaty, and kind of broke some of the trust Native Americans had. But that was after Penn had died. But William Penn then wrote this frame of government for the colony of Pennsylvania. And I want to highlight 5 things in that frame of government. It's quite a long document. You can look it up, read the whole thing. First off, representative government. You're not going to have a king or an absolute ruler or autocrat, but we're going to have a representative government. Second, we're going to have public schools. Back then, you had to be fairly wealthy to afford going to school. But Penn chartered a public school in 1689 that's still called William Penn Charter School, now a private school. And at the same time, established Friends Select School, 1689, where I taught, 1982 to 1984. I'm not quite that old. But select for just Quakers. This is where Quaker kids could go. But there was a public school for others. Now, I also taught, as Larry mentioned, at Friends Central School, because it used to be the central school high school to which the Hicksite Quakers in Philadelphia would go from their various middle schools. And the joke among Quaker educators in Philadelphia is that Friends Select is no longer select, and Friends Central is no longer central. The other joke is that Quaker schools in Philadelphia are where Episcopal faculty teach Jewish kids how to be good Quakers. So, public schools. A third, justice in courts, habeas corpus, and trial by jury. Now, this was especially important for William Penn because there's still a principle of jurisprudence called Bushell's case. Any of you lawyers here, you may know Bushell's case. In the 1660s, William Penn, recently convinced friend, and a fellow friend, William Meade, were arrested for attending a Quaker meeting in Grace Church Street in London. Quakers were not allowed. They were nonconformists. They were illegal. You could not hold Quaker meeting or attend worship that wasn't under the leadership of the Church of England and the Book of Common Prayer. So they were arrested, taken into court, and the trial was held, and the judge ordered the jury to bring back a guilty verdict, that they were guilty. And off they went, sequestered, and they came back, and the foreman, Bushell, of the jury said, "We find the defendants not guilty." Again, this is beginning, you see kind of the uprising of those questions of authority from the Civil War and those questions of democracy. The judge was enraged and sent the jury into prison and said, "You're not allowed out of here, and you won't have meat or tobacco until you bring back a guilty verdict." So they come back out. The foreman, Bushell, says, "We find them guilty of speaking in Grace Church Street," because they had shared the Quaker message. Well, that was not a punishable offense. So the judge sent them back to jail, would not allow them out until they brought a guilty verdict. But bit by bit, over the succeeding days and weeks, allowed a few out, and a few out, a few out. Bushell was still in there, and essentially became a huge case in the public. This was an overreach of authority, and finally were released, and still Bushell's case is a linchpin of our freedom of trial by jury without prejudice from the court. So that understanding of justice and trial by jury, habeas corpus, is important. A fourth, very significant one, was freedom of religion. Separation of church and state. That in the colony of Pennsylvania, anyone who believed in God could vote, could take office, had freedom of expression. The second ever Jewish synagogue was in Philadelphia. The first one was in Charleston, South Carolina, for some reason. But Catholics were welcome. Jews were welcome. If there were Muslims, they would have been welcome. Early Quakers often cited Muslim writings to talk about the inward light, and those who turned to that light, even though they'd never heard of Jesus or worshiped Jesus, would be saved by that light if they turned to it. And this, again, arises out of that period where Quakers were punished for practicing a religion that wasn't the Church of England, that wasn't sponsored by the state. Quakers died in prison because of that. Quakers were hanged, as I mentioned, stripped naked in public for being Quaker in a place like Boston. Puritans weren't amused either by these Quakers. So a foundational understanding in Pennsylvania was a separation of church and state and freedom of conscience, soul liberty, and that anyone could participate in civic life regardless of their religion. And then finally, rule of law. We're a colony of laws, and we're guided by that. The Charter of Privileges, later on, 1701, instituted these, pretty much cataloged them. Again, freedom of religion or not to practice. That's important too.